The rain hammered against the windows of the Harrison building, a relentless downpour that had plagued the campus all week. The third floor smelled of mildew and old wood, a scent that clung to the walls like a ghost. Room 315 was at the end of the hallway, and as I approached, the smell of smoke hit me, thick, acrid, and unnatural. It wasn't the kind of smoke from a fire, but something older, darker, like incense burned in a forgotten temple. My stomach churned as I pushed open the door. The classroom was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. A few students were already seated, their faces shadowed. At the front of the room stood Professor Manney, tall and gaunt, his hollow cheeks accentuated by the flickering light. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to pierce through me as I entered. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly, like stones grinding together. "Your name?" "Jeremy Mitchell," I replied, trying to sound confident. He scanned a sheet on his desk, made a check mark, and gestured for me to sit. I chose a seat in the third row, close to the wall, and pulled out my laptop. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. There were only 10 of us, a small class for such a niche subject. I didn't think much of it at the time. Professor Manney began the class by introducing himself and going over the syllabus. It was unusual, to say the least. We were required to purchase candles and an Aztec Death Whistle, a small, skull-shaped instrument that supposedly mimicked the sound of a human scream. There was also an extra credit opportunity, donating blood to the Red Cross. And then there was the final exam, a camping trip, funded by the university, he said, as if that made it less bizarre. The first few weeks were normal enough. Professor Manney lectured on Aztec history, their empire, their gods, but there were moments, small, unsettling moments, that made me uneasy. The way he lingered on certain topics, like human sacrifice, his voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a secret. The way his eyes would glaze over when he talked about Mictlantecuhtli, the Aztec god of death. It was as if he wasn't just teaching about the god, he was worshipping him. Then came spring break. I stayed on campus, picking up extra shifts at Starbucks to make some cash. On Thursday, I got an email from Professor Manney. "Dear Jeremy, I hope your spring break is going well. The Red Cross blood donation will be on campus this Friday. I suggest you participate to earn extra credit. Best, Professor Manney." I hadn't told him I was staying on campus. How did he know? I brushed it off, assuming he'd seen me around, but when I returned to class, Sydney pulled me aside. Her usual carefree demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. "Jeremy, did you get an email from Manney over break?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, about the blood donation." "Why?" "Because he sent me the same email. And Clara too. He knew we were staying on campus." "How?" I didn't have an answer, but what really shook me was when Clara told us Matt had gotten the same email, and then he vanished, just like that. No texts, no calls, no trace. He stopped coming to class, stopped answering his phone. The police were called, but they found nothing. It was as if he'd been swallowed by the earth itself. After Matt's disappearance, the class changed. Professor Manney's lectures became darker, more focused on Mictlantecuhtli. He spoke of the god with a reverence that bordered on obsession, describing the underworld in vivid detail, a place of eternal darkness, where souls wandered endlessly. He even brought in an Aztec death whistle one day, blowing into it during class. The sound was horrifying, a piercing scream that echoed in my bones. I swear I saw him smile as we flinched. The camping trip was now only a week away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with each passing day. I started researching Mictlantecuhtli, trying to understand why Manney was so fixated on him. What I found only deepened my fear. Mictlantecuhtli wasn't just the god of death, he was a god of endings, destruction. He demanded blood sacrifices, and his priests were said to perform rituals in the darkest hours of the night. There were stories of people disappearing, lured into the underworld by the god's whispers. And then there were the death whistles, used not just in battle, but in rituals to summon the dead. The night before the camping trip, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Matt, about the way Manney's eyes gleamed when he talked about Mictlantecuhtli, about the candles, the whistles, the blood donation. It all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see. The trip itself was a nightmare. We drove deep into the woods, to a remote campsite surrounded by towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, like blood. Professor Manney was unusually cheerful, his movements sharp and deliberate as he set up camp. That night, he gathered us around a fire, the flames casting long shadows on the trees. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and hypnotic, "we honor Mictlantecuhtli. We give him what he desires." My heart raced as he handed each of us a candle and a death whistle. The other students seemed entranced, their eyes glazed over as they followed his instructions. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Manney began chanting in a language I didn't understand, his voice rising and falling like a dirge. The sound of the death whistles filled the air, a chorus of screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And then I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, tall and skeletal, its eyes glowing like embers. Mictlantecuhtli, the god of death. Manney fell to his knees, his voice trembling with reverence. The other students followed suit, their faces blank, their souls seemingly already claimed. I turned and ran, the screams of the whistles echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my lungs burning, my mind racing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next day, the police found the campsite. The fire was still smoldering, the candles melted into strange patterns on the ground. But there was no sign of Professor Manney or the other students. They were gone, vanished without a trace. I never went back to that campus. I changed my name, moved to another state, tried to forget, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it, the sound of an Aztec death whistle, calling me back to the darkness.